For a century, the Titanic has been hidden in darkness. But now, a new investigation is about to drain the ocean. We uncover critical new pieces of evidence not previously visible.
For more than 100 years, the Titanic has sat in total silence, but a new mission sent an advanced underwater drone into places no person has seen since 1912.
And then you zoom in. Having a comprehensive view of the entirety of the wreck site is key to understanding what happened here.
It slipped into a hidden room, sealed since the night the ship went down. What the camera found inside stopped the entire team cold, and the deeper the drone pushed, the clearer it became that the real story of the Titanic is far darker than we ever imagined. The dangerous journey down to the Titanic. The North Atlantic, where the Titanic rests, is harsh and lonely. The water sits just above freezing, storms roll through again and again, and thick fog can close in so fast that ships seem to vanish. The seafloor under this patch of ocean drops to about 12,500 feet, more than 2 miles straight down. At that depth, the rules change. The pressure is roughly 380 times what we feel at the surface, close to 6,000 pounds pressing on every square inch of metal or glass. A normal ship or diver would crush long before reaching the bottom. Sunlight never gets that far, so it is always night. The ship that lies in this dark zone left Southampton in the spring of 1912, struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and sank on her first trip toward New York with more than 1,500 lives lost. For over 70 years, no one knew exactly where she rested. In the mid-1980s, oceanographer Robert Ballard and a joint United States and French team finally found the wreck while secretly working on a United States Navy mission that was actually meant to search for lost submarines. Their towed cameras first crossed a trail of scattered objects and then came upon the broken bow and stern sections sitting in the mud many yards apart. Early expeditions and the crude dives that followed focused on the outside of the ship. Submersibles circled the bow and stern, filmed the anchor chains and cargo hatches, and traced the long debris field where dishes, beams, and pieces of hull lie spread out on the bottom. Going deep inside was always much harder. Corridors have collapsed. Decks have folded into the spaces below. Loose beams and hanging cables turn many openings into traps. A robot or small sub that gets its line caught there may never come back. While explorers were learning how to work around the wreck itself was changing. Since the ship sank, deep-sea bacteria and other tiny life have been slowly eating the steel and turning it into reddish-brown growths called rusticles that hang from the hull. Scientists even named a special iron-eating bacterium, Halomonas titanicae, from samples taken at the site, and studies suggest that microbes like this could break down much of the remaining steel within the next few decades.
During the sinking, an initial impact will have twisted and turned metal and in the steel that have now made it much more available to biodeterioration. Naturally forming bacteria in the environment attach and start degrading the wreck.
Other surveys warn that whole sections of the ship may slump to the seafloor within about 50 years as the metal grows thinner and weaker. A major expedition in 1929 found that the starboard officers' quarters, where the captain's rooms were located, had already slumped and broken open. A bathtub that once stood out clearly inside those rooms is now hard to spot because the overlying structure has fallen across it. Railings and parts of the forward mast have given way. Areas that once showed clean lines and corners now look like soft piles of rust. The wreck is not fixed in time. It is slowly collapsing while people watch. There is also damage from human visits. Early submersibles sometimes brushed against railings or hull plates or set down on delicate areas, bending or cracking metal and stirring up clouds of rust. As the years passed, the site began to draw paying visitors who wanted to ride in small private craft down to see the famous bow for themselves. In the summer of 2023, a privately built tourist sub called Titan imploded during a dive near the wreck, killing all 5 people on board. Investigators later found that its experimental carbon fiber hull and poor testing made the disaster a preventable failure, a brutal warning of what happens when safety rules are ignored in this kind of place. A new mission grew out of that mix of urgency and warning. The wreck was falling apart, but sending people down in risky craft was no longer acceptable. The planners chose a different tool. They decided to rely on a small robot submarine that never left its cable to the ship on the surface. Its job was not to grab plates or jewelry. Its job was to go farther inside the Titanic than past robots had gone, and to record one more fairly closed-off pocket of the wreck before that pocket was lost forever. The group that came together for this work was clear and focused. There were robot pilots who knew how to fly machines underwater using joysticks and screens. There were marine engineers who designed pressure housings, cables, and thrusters. There were experts in ship history and wreck sites who had spent years reading the Titanic's deck plans, crew lists, and survivor accounts. There were also corrosion and structure specialists who could look at a frame or beam and tell whether it should carry weight or be avoided. They shared one simple aim. They wanted to leave behind a sharp visual record of one more hidden room inside the Titanic while there was still something left in that room to see. Before anyone went to sea, the engineers built and tested the robot again and again. It was a steel and alloy frame with a set of small propellers, called thrusters, that pointed in different directions. Those thrusters let it move forward and back, slide sideways, rise and sink, and turn in place. The frame held bright lamps with soft covers, so the light spread out in wide beams instead of drilling a tight spot into the silt. Several cameras sat in clear domes, one looking forward and others looking to the sides and down, so the pilots could see both what lay ahead and what might scrape the cable. Every opening in the frame was sealed with thick rings and bolts. Every place where power or data passed through the skin was pressure tested in special tanks that squeezed the robot to the same force it would face on the bottom. If anything leaked or bent, the part was changed before it went to sea. The result was a small machine that could live in pressure that would crush a battle tank, slip through gaps only a few feet wide, and still send a clean picture back to the surface. The robot was linked to a compact control room on the deck of a chartered research ship through a long, heavy cable. Power flowed down, and live video and sonar came back up. Inside the control room, pilots sat at their screens with hands on joysticks. Next to them, a navigator watched depth and position readings, and sonar staff looked at gray displays that showed large shapes ahead even before the cameras reached them. The wreck experts kept printed deck plans and old photos spread out so they could match the live view to known parts of the ship once the robot got close. The ship that carried this gear was built for work far from land. It had a wide back deck for cranes and winches, and a strong hull to handle large waves. It held position over the known site of the Titanic's bow by using its own thrusters, because drifting even a short distance could pull the robot into wreckage or snap the cable. Air on deck could sit below freezing, and in winter, the sea could throw up waves high enough to bury the bow of smaller boats. Robot launch and recovery drills were practiced in calmer water before the ship ever reached the site. Emergency steps were written out and rehearsed in case the robot lost power, lost a light, or felt a hard tug that might mean the cable had snagged. When the weather over the site finally opened a short window, they moved into position. The robot hung from a crane above the back deck, its lamps dark. Crew members in hard hats guided it with ropes as the crane swung it out over the water. On a signal from the lead pilot, the crane lowered the frame into the gray chop. The lamps came on, throwing pale cones into the sea. Once the robot floated clear of the hull, the crane hook released, a winch began to pay out cable, and the long fall toward the bottom began. Inside the control room, depth and temperature readings changed as the robot sank. After a long descent, a faint gray sheet started to rise at the bottom of the screen. The pilot eased the thrusters and slowed the fall. The gray sharpened into the flat mud and silt of the deep sea floor. The robot stopped a short distance above it, high enough that the wash from the thrusters would not blast the soft grains into a blinding cloud. The navigator checked the position and called out a direction toward the point where the bow section should appear. At first, the view showed nothing but the empty seabed, interrupted only by a few pieces of wreckage. As the robot glided on, the debris grew thicker. Whole bathtubs, deck fittings, light fixtures, and larger sections of torn steel passed slowly by in the twin beams. The pilot steered a winding path between them, careful not to let the cable catch on sharp edges. Then a dark mass began to rise out of the gloom ahead. The pilot raised the robot a little and angled the lamps up. The bow of the Titanic came into view. The pilots made a slow pass along the side and over the top of the bow. Once they were sure of their place on the wreck, they turned to the main goal of this trip. From earlier sonar work and careful study, they knew that some parts of the interior had been more shielded from strong currents than others. In those spots, doors jammed shut, bulkheads folded over openings, or fallen deck plates formed rough caps that slowed the flow of water. Behind these barriers, silt could settle in thick layers, and light objects did not get swept far from where they first fell. It was one of those quieter pockets that this robot had been built to reach. The team studied their charts and live sonar to pick a way inside. They did not choose the largest, hole, or the grandest doorway. Those places were often too open, with hanging plates that could fall without warning. Instead, they picked a lower and narrower gap in the hull near service passages that once linked dining rooms, cabins, and storage spaces. Earlier missions only caught brief glimpses of these areas. This time, the plan was to go deeper. The pilot brought the robot toward the chosen opening. Up close, the torn steel looked like jagged teeth. The lamps reached only a short way into the darkness beyond. The pilot made very small moves, tapping the thrusters to keep the frame centered so that neither the robot nor its cable scraped the edges. When the way looked clear, the robot nosed forward, and the hull slipped past on both sides. The feeling inside the control room changed at once. Outside, the robot had space to rise or fall. In here, the walls were close. Each short burst from the thrusters lifted a thin cloud of silt from the floor, so the pilot paused between moves and let the haze sink back down. Slowly, the robot moved along the passage, past open doorways that once led into cabins and public rooms. The wreck experts traced lines across their deck plans, matching each bend and junction to the map in front of them. As the robot turned another corner, the sonar started to pick up something unusual ahead. Beyond a fallen beam and a tangle of loose metal, there was a space that looked more closed off than the rest. A twisted doorway and bulkhead had blocked much of the opening, and the water inside seemed calmer. Up to this point, the robot had only passed through places the ocean had worked over for more than a century. That calm, sheltered space pointed to a room the sea had not fully destroyed, where traces of real people may still remain. The most heartbreaking room on the Titanic. The pilot rolled the ROV a little to one side and slid it through. On the far side, the water changed at once. There were fewer drifting specks in the beam. Nothing moved unless the thrusters did. It felt like stepping from a windy street into a closed room. The place they had entered was not perfect or whole. The ceiling arched down and was split in one corner. Long, thin rusticles hung in loose ropes. A wardrobe had toppled and now rested on its side. A chair lay upside down near the foot of what might once have been a bunk, but compared to the broken spaces outside, this room looked strangely ordered. Door frames still stood straight. Strips of dark paneling still clung to the walls. The floor was covered in a smooth, even layer of silt, as if dust had been settling there for a very long time without being disturbed. As the camera swept across the entrance, the first small details came into view. Just inside the doorway lay a pair of shoes. They were small, not much longer than the span of a hand, and they lay side by side with their toes pointing into the room. The leather was dark, but still kept the curve of the heel and the shape of the toes. The silt around them was smooth and unmarked. On many dives around Titanic, pairs of shoes like this have shown where a person's body once came to rest. Soft tissue and bone break down in this water, but the leather stays, helped by the same tanning chemicals that protect bags and belts. Here, inside this sheltered pocket, the small shoes were not scattered through the debris field. They sat in the doorway, as if whoever wore them had taken a final step and never moved again. A short distance away, a second shoe lay on its side. This one was larger and rougher, with a thicker sole and deeper creases across the top. The stitching along its edge was still visible as a faint pattern of small, even marks. There was no matching shoe in sight. Against one wall, slumped near what might have been a built-in seat, lay a suitcase. The leather shell had sagged, but the curve of a handle and the line of a clasp were still clear. On other dives, teams have raised similar bags from the debris field. One well-known case is the suitcase of a teenage second-class passenger named Edgar Samuel Andrew, which still held shirts, collars, and small personal items when it was opened. Another set of bags turned out to belong to a dressmaker named Marion Meanwell. Her alligator skin purse kept papers dry enough for experts to read her name, her job, and even a receipt for a canary she was carrying for family. Looking at the case in this sealed room, the crew knew that if anyone ever opened it, the inside might hold the same kind of quiet details. The casing here had split in one corner, and the camera moved closer to see what was pushing out. A pale, curved shape showed through the gap. It was the back of a hairbrush, its bristles mostly gone. Beside it lay the thin frame of a pair of spectacles, the glass fallen away from the metal rings. A small bottle sat at an angle, its glass cloudy, but whole. Near the hinge of the case, a lump of darker material sat half buried in the silt. In other raised suitcases, blocks like this have turned out to be stacks of letters, tickets, and notes pressed together by time. On a lower shelf, or perhaps on the collapsed edge of a bunk, the light caught something that did not look like part of the ship at all. It was a toy, simple and small. The paint was gone, but the shape was still clear enough to read. A small animal on wheels, with a rounded body and a head turned slightly to one side. One edge of the base was buried in silt. A few inches away lay a tiny shoe, even smaller than the pair at the door. Its leather was cracked, but the outline of the sole was still sharp. The distance between the toy and the shoe was hardly more than the length of a forearm. It was hard not to think of real children from the ship when the camera showed that corner. Titanic carried many families, some in second class and many more in third class, heading for new lives. Survivor accounts tell how mothers and fathers tried to calm their children as the ship listed and the lights flickered. One fashion buyer, Edith Rosenbaum, later told how she climbed into a lifeboat with a musical toy pig that played a tune when its tail was twisted, and how she used it to comfort frightened children as the boat pulled away from the ship. The drone drifted a few feet farther along the wall. Near the floor, under a hanging strip of rust, something bright flashed back at the camera. The pilot steadied the ROV and eased it closer. At first, it looked like just another scrap of twisted metal, but as the light fell across it from the side, a thin chain came into view. It lay curled into itself, with a small oval pendant at one end. The metal was dark, but its smooth edge and the faint line of a hinge showed that it had once opened and closed, like a locket. Jewelry has appeared before in the debris field in ways that almost seem impossible. In the late 1980s, salvors found a leather Gladstone-style bag packed with fine pieces that later toured as the jewels of the Titanic, including delicate diamond rings and chains that had been locked away from light for decades. More recently, a black glass heart necklace was found inside a hard shell of rock-like material that had built up around it on the sea floor. In this quieter room, the small pendant and chain told the same story in simpler form. Someone had once fastened it and worn it against their clothes, never thinking it would end up here. Near the pendant lay the face of a watch. The hands were gone, but the ring of numbers was still just visible along the edge. Many watches brought up from the Titanic stopped within minutes of plunging into cold seawater. The camera turned toward the far corner of the compartment, the quietest part of the room. The ceiling there sagged lower than anywhere else, and thick rusticles hung almost to the floor. Under them, the silt lay in a deep, smooth layer. As the light moved across it, more shapes appeared. A lower bunk frame ran along the wall, its metal bent but still in one piece. At the edge of that frame, another small pair of shoes rested close together, toes pointing toward the bed. Between them, half pressed into the floor, was what looked like the head of a doll. The features were worn away, but the curve of the forehead and the hint of hair were still there. Beside the bunk, a metal cup lay on its side, half buried. A short line of buttons led away from it, each one a different size. One still clung to a scrap of cloth that moved slightly when the ROV's lights warmed the water. Taken by themselves, none of these items could tell a full story. Together, they felt like the last trace of a family huddled in that corner while something terrible happened just outside the doorway. Beyond the walls of the room, the rest of the wreck was still slowly tearing itself apart. In other preserved corners, experts have already watched walls bow and railings fall between visits as rust eats through load-bearing metal. Looking at the bent ceiling and hanging rust here, no one doubted that this pocket would also fall someday. The ROV eased backward toward the gap it had come through, one small burst of thrust at a time. The next steps would not happen down here. They would unfold later, far above the wreck, as people tried to read that room the way they would read a letter, using every object on its floor as a line in a story about how Titanic's final minutes played out for the people trapped inside. What this room reveals about Titanic's final hours. The hard drive from the dive did not look like much, but it held thousands of high-resolution images, depth readings, and navigation tracks from the robot's time inside the ship. Analysts loaded all of it into powerful computers and began to stitch the pictures and distance points together until the sealed room and its hallway turned into a full three-dimensional model on the screen. That small model was then locked into something even larger. In recent years, survey teams have built a full digital twin of the wreck, a complete computer copy of the liner that lives as billions of dots in 3 dimensions. It was made by scanning every inch of the bow, stern, and debris field with cameras and lasers during long survey dives, then lining up the images into one giant point cloud. The sealed compartment from the dive slotted into that wider model like a missing tile in a floor. Once the computers matched wall angles and deck heights, the team could see exactly where the room sat in the ship's layout, how much the floor was tilted, and which bulkheads and stairwells lay around it. Plotted this way, the quiet space with the shoes, suitcase, toy, and bunk was no longer just a sad corner on a screen. It became a fixed point in the map of how the ship tore, flooded, and died. That bigger model has already sharpened the story of the sinking. Old inquiries said the iceberg gashed one long rip down the starboard side. New scans and computer runs that copy the collision in slow motion point to something more subtle and more deadly. They suggest a series of smaller punctures scattered along about 6 watertight compartments, just enough to doom a ship that could have survived with only 4 flooded. The same work has picked up tiny but important details. One porthole on the bow appears smashed outward, matching survivor stories that ice and water blew straight into some cabins when the berg scraped past. Some huge boilers look dented inward, as if they hit the bottom hard when the hull broke. A key steam exhaust on the stern shows in the scan as frozen in the open position, which fits with the long-held belief that the engineering crew kept steam and power flowing as long as they could, so the lights would stay on while people tried to reach the lifeboats. With the sealed room locked inside that context, the team could now ask very specific questions. The digital twin showed exactly how far that section of hallway was from known hull damage and from the main stairwells that acted like funnels for water. It showed how steeply the deck under those small shoes and that fallen cup was leaning by the time they settled. When the computer replayed the sinking as a step-by-step rise of water through each compartment, the route to that little pocket became clearer. The layout of the objects in the room started to look less random. The pair of small shoes side by side in the doorway, the single worn boot a short distance away, the suitcase slumped against the wall, and the clump of belongings by the bunk were not just sad leftovers. They were clues. On the model, all of those pieces lined up slightly downhill toward one part of the room, matching the direction the ship was leaning in the later stages of the sinking. That tilt would have pulled loose items and people in the same direction as the water rushed in. The suitcase against the wall sat in a tight corner where the floor, bunk frame, and paneling met. In the computer copy, when the team ran a simple water flow, that exact corner showed up as a place where any sudden flood would slam lighter things and then leave them there when the current eased. The toy and the tiny shoe by the bunk sat just above that line, close to the spot where someone small might have climbed up to get clear of the rising water for a few last seconds. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.